Good morning. Good morning. I'm Paul Grogan, president of the foundation, and we're going to get started. Apparently there's some tea problems that are even more ghastly than usual, delaying many, but folks will trickle in. But we do have a full program, so we thought we ought to get started. So welcome to this session, which is entitled Grade Incomplete, Implementation of the Community College Funding Formula in Massachusetts. And we have really an all-star lineup. We're not going to take a lot of time going through the bios of the speakers, which are really sterling, but you do have bios at your place, and as you can see, we've got a terrific program in store. I see many familiar faces in the room, so I think most of you are familiar with the Boston Foundation and have been here many times. For those of you, though, who may be here for the first time, I want to give you a particularly warm welcome and express the hope that you will find reason to be here many times in the future. The Boston Foundation is Greater Boston's community foundation, a 103-year-old charity that is now stewarding over $1.2 billion in philanthropic capital on behalf of this community, and we and the donors of the foundation are by far the largest grant maker in New England, distributing well over $100 million a year for the past number of years. But in addition to our stewardship and grant making, we like to play a role which we call civic leadership, which is really using the offices of the foundation to pull people and ideas and data together to help define the challenges and opportunities this community faces and to act on them. And so to that end, the foundation commissions, as we have for this morning, a significant amount of research in addition to conducting our own through the Boston Indicators Project, which many of you are familiar with. We hold forums like this. We engage deeply in a nonpartisan way in public policy, and it's become a more and more important part of what we do. A number of years ago, as part of our education portfolio, we developed an interest in the community colleges of the Commonwealth and their status and performance and role in meeting the workforce needs of the Commonwealth. And, you know, I think it's well known that Massachusetts is not exactly a champion historically when it comes to supporting public higher education. There's one of the side effects, the unfortunate side effects of having so many glorious private institutions of higher education that we have, in a way, implicitly kidded ourselves that we don't need to make the same kinds of investment in public higher ed that other states routinely make. Well, this is absolutely false, as we now know. The workforce of the future will be overwhelmingly coming from our institutions of public higher ed, including our community colleges. So to not make those a priority is an act of wounding ourselves. And to that end of sort of raising this issue, the foundation in the early part of this decade did commission a number of studies. One of them prompted the reform effort, part of which we're talking about in the funding formula today. But we continue to believe that the Commonwealth cannot thrive without a first-rate community college system that is fulfilling both a robust academic mission and a workforce mission at the same time. It's simply inconceivable that we will get there without our community colleges. So today's subject, while it offers a fascinating point of entry into an aspect of the reform effort a few years ago, our aim today is not simply to wrestle the funding formula to the ground or propose a new one, but to use this as an entry point to discuss the broader issues that we really have to deal with if we're going to realize this ambition of a first-rate community college system. So again, thank you all for being here. I think it's going to be a very illuminating discussion, and to get us going, it's my pleasure to introduce our colleague from the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, an institution that does absolutely first-rate work, and we have taken advantage of their capacities many times in the past, Eileen McAnenny, who is the president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. Eileen?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here. we're really excited to collaborate with the Boston Foundation, and I want to commend you for your leadership on community colleges and on education funding more broadly. This report adds to a growing body of research and important work, and so we're happy to participate in this discussion and to be a part of it. Before I delve in, though, I do want to give a special thanks to Elizabeth and to Antonia for their insights and their perspective as we work through the project. And I have to give a shout out to Doug Howgate, who was the Director of Research and Policy at the Mass Taxpayers Foundation and the primary author of this report. Is this the clicker? Okay, thanks. So before we delve in, I do want to give just a quick overview about the work of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. As Paul said, we too are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization. And our mission is to provide public and private decision makers with insightful, timely, and unbiased research. But we don't stop at just research. We also try to offer constructive solutions to a lot of the prominent policy decisions that lawmakers are making, and to move the Commonwealth forward, both in terms of its fiscal soundness and its long-term economic growth. So in the short time that I have today, I'm hoping to do 4 things. I'd like to cover 4 topics briefly. The first is really just kind of the backdrop and a quick review of what led to the community college funding formula. Then we want to talk about the funding formula itself. Then we'll switch and talk about the implementation. And finally, just lessons learned and the potential path forward. So my understanding is questions will be at the end. If you have a burning question, I'm happy to take it during the course of the presentation. So let's look at what was happening in 2012, immediately prior to the development of the funding formula. There were several things. One is that the enrollment in community colleges was surging. You can see from this chart, the red bar represents the average growth, but it was growth of almost 15%, which is pretty sizable. And you contrast that with growth in enrollment in the public 4-year universities that saw about 4,000 new students and growth of about 9%, so significantly more. But what you can also see is there's wide variation among the community colleges. So you have Bunker Hill on the left there with almost 44% growth. And then look at on the other side, you have Cape Cod Community that was actually losing some of its student population. You also can see, I think that there was a growing recognition of the importance of community colleges in the post-secondary space and as an institution that could prepare our workforce for changing jobs. Increasingly, people needed some education beyond high school, but as we know, the cost of 4-year education is growing increasingly unaffordable for more and more people. And so community colleges were well positioned to provide these services. So we also want to look at kind of the differences among the community colleges. They serve a more diverse population than our public higher institutions in general, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of educational attainment levels. So very diverse, but like enrollment, that diversity varies among the individual colleges. And so again, what this chart tries to show is kind of the variation and give you a sense of that. The red bar shows the percentage of non-white students enrolled, which you can see it's about 41% on average, but again, with great variation. Roxbury Community College had almost 93, and you can see in Greenfield less than 20%. And I think that these demographics essentially reflect the demographics of the broader regions in which the community colleges are located. So, like enrollment, like diversity, state funding also varied widely, and you can get a sense of that in this report. So if you look, you have per capita spending at $931 at Bunker Hill Community College and at $2,600 at Berkshire Community College. And you can see there's really kind of no rhyme or reason, because there are 4 that have funding under $1,400, there are 4 that have funding over $2,200, and really, as I said, it's not clear how this per capita funding was derived, but I do think, some of it obviously is because there's fixed cost, and so it varies depending on the student population, but that doesn't explain it all. So the other thing that was happening, I think Massachusetts was kind of doing some soul searching and realizing that our community college system, as Paul said, had room for improvement. If you looked at how Massachusetts stacked up relative to other peer states, we weren't doing that well. There was certainly room for improvement. And you can look and see, both in terms of funding and student cost, Massachusetts was not leading the nation. We were 33rd in terms of state support for community colleges, and we were on the high side with respect to student cost and fees, tuition, and so forth. The other thing is, we really weren't having a high success rate as far as having students complete their education in a timely manner. So this measures how many students actually received a degree within 6 years. And you can see, we certainly weren't leading, the average. Texas was by 58%. Ours was only 45%. So we had significant catch-up to do, for sure. Okay, and finally, I think that there was a growing body of research, and certainly the Boston Foundation contributed to it, that was looking at, how we could go about changing the funding formula and how important it was and why we needed to engage in this work. And so you can see some of the reports, I won't go into it, but they all concluded there was a need for us to focus on community colleges and to fund them in a rational way. So what did the funding formula do? Several things. I think as the case was made to public policy makers, they agreed and they charged the Department of Higher Education with developing the funding formula. And they wanted to, the funding formula consisted of 3 components. One was an operating subsidy. It was a flat rate given to each of the 15 community colleges. The second component, and what they did is, with the money left over after the operating subsidy, they divided it in half. Half of it went to base funding, which was essentially intended to ensure that campus funding is based on enrollment and to mitigate the funding inequities. And then the other half of the money was used for performance funding. So it was to move the needle. They used several metrics, 8 with respect to course completion and others with respect to workforce alignment. The idea was to move community colleges along so that they better prepared folks for the jobs that were currently available. So as they offered, a curricula that was aligned with that, they were rewarded, and then that was the notion. It also was to align with the Vision Project, which was some work that the Patrick administration had done. So that was what they were attempting to do. I think there are important elements to the funding formula as it actually, the final version, as it was actually created. One was it was intended to be used for all of the money that went to community colleges. It was not intended just for marginal increases, but as we'll see, it wasn't implemented that way. I think the other issue is when there is funding formula changes, and it's true really of all public funding, there's a concern about they don't want to harm folks who are counting on a certain amount of money. So there is a hold harmless provision or some type of stop-loss mechanism to mitigate those differences. But I guess the downside of having a stop-loss provision is when you try to mitigate the differences, you also mitigate the amount of change that you're able to implement in a short period of time. And the other thing, the funding formula did not include the cost of collective bargaining increases. So that was going to be dealt with separately. And the other notable element is never did the state actually set forth the amount that they wanted to fund community colleges in the aggregate. So there was no bogey that we were to work towards. Instead, it was about distributing money, but the amount of money was left, unspecified. So the formula in action. The formula was implemented for the first time in fiscal year 2014. And it had, in total, it was about $245, almost $246 million that was appropriated to community colleges. Of this, though, as you can see, a lot of it was in the form of base aid. Only 20 million of that 246 actually was distributed according to the formula. So it was a small portion of the overall funding formula, but I think we can see that it actually did make a difference. And we'll get into that in just a second. But it is unfortunate because really fiscal year 14 is the one year that we can look to where they tried most closely to adhere to the funding formula, and even then you can see it was for a small portion of the overall funding that they actually did. So if you look, what this chart is trying to demonstrate, and it's probably a little hard to read, so let me just try to kind of walk through it. But the column on the left talks about the funding that each individual community college received pre-funding formula, so prior to fiscal year 2014. The middle column shows the amount of money out of the $20 million that was actually appropriated according to the funding formula, what each of the community colleges received. And what it shows is there would have been, and there was, a considerable difference to the amount of money that community colleges received according to the historic precedent, if you will, and what they received under the funding formula. So this would have, had it been implemented, had a sizable difference in how the funding was actually allocated among the universities. Sorry, so my voice, while I care deeply about this issue, if it's cracking, it's not out of emotion, it's fighting a pretty good cold, so my apologies for that. But any questions or anything with respect to that? No? Okay. So what this funding formula, and again, I apologize, it's probably hard for you to see the numbers, but the first formula, the first column again is before the funding formula was implemented. The second column is the $20 million that was appropriated. The third is if the full appropriation had been allocated by the funding formula, what would have happened. But the last column represents the progress that we made towards that full funding formula implementation with just the $20 million. And the point is, it moved the needle, and so it did hold out promise, and it was worth pursuing. And just with that little money, you can see the variation in the funding pre-formula and after the formula. So in fiscal year 2015 and 16, policymakers did adhere to the funding formula, but again, only for marginal increases. They didn't use it for the full appropriation. But also happening at that time, there were some fiscal challenges. There was less money that was appropriated in the aggregate to community colleges. And the other thing is, it wasn't as transparent how the money was allocated. So as I had mentioned, For the base funding and for the performance funding, there were several metrics. There were 12 or more, and it was a fairly complicated formula. But we didn't have access to how those factored in to the actual distribution. So it's really difficult to understand, how they made those appropriations and why. And I think that too was one of the shortcomings of the implementation, because in addition to not giving it adequate time, they also didn't allow it to be subject to public scrutiny. Like organizations like the Boston Foundation or MTF couldn't really tease through the data and understand more what was happening. So again, this is just trying to show over 3 years how we move the needle. And you can see the numbers kind of speak for themselves, but certainly you look at the case of Bunker Hill, and their appropriation would have gone up to 14.2% of the revenues from 8.4. Conversely, you look at Springfield Tech, their appropriation would have gone down considerably. And that was, what was intended, right? If we wanted the money to go with enrollment to follow the student and to follow the entities that were actually offering coursework that we thought was important and that would prepare folks for the jobs of today. So taking stock of the formula, just trying to wrap it up and talk about it. Over the 3-year period, 69% of all new community college funds were distributed through the formula, but it was not all of the funds as intended. And even just with that modest attempt to implement, it did move the needle for 13 of 15 community colleges. They moved closer to their full funding formula share. And so I think that indicates there was promise of change. But again, unfortunately, we won't know for certain because we didn't give it adequate time. There are a couple of things that have happened since the attempt to implement the funding formula, and one important development is that community college enrollment is down. So it peaked in 2012 when the funding formula was being developed. Since then, though, it's been on the decline. And so that's another variable that makes it hard to really measure progress of the funding formula and if it had its intended effect for the marginal dollars. So let me just quickly turn to, I don't want to go over my time, but let me just quickly turn to the last point that I wanted to do and to talk about a path forward in the lessons learned. So I think not to be undervalued is the fact that the formula was developed with input from the community colleges and from the Mass Teachers Association and with expertise from a national consultant. And so it was a promising formula, it was a rational formula, and I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We could build on the success of that formula. One of the things, though, I think that hurt the ability, certainly, to measure its effectiveness was that there wasn't clear goals established. So, for instance, we didn't specify, did we want to meet a certain per-student funding rate? Or did we want to have an aggregate amount? Or did we want to accomplish certain completion rates? So I think being more specific about the goals and then being able to measure progress against them would certainly help with the buy-in for the funding formula. We also need to be realistic. I think there were certain concerns about holding community colleges harmless, that maybe the change, if we went to the formula all at once, would be too much too soon for some of the institutions, and so maybe we needed a more gradual glide path or some kind of mitigating factor for a finite period of time. So, those are things to consider. Also, one of the interesting things is the funding formula was actually never put into statute. It wasn't codified, and if you think about other education funding formulas for K through 12, for special ed, for a whole host of other components of education, Those funding formulas are in the general laws, and it's important for a few reasons. One, they have the force of law, but two, it means they withstand, different administrations, different priorities, and so forth. And it gives it a little more heft and certainly more staying power, and so that's something to consider as we go forward. And the other thing, we may have tried to accomplish too much, in the funding formula itself. So when it's complicated, it makes it a little more difficult for people to evaluate, it makes it a little more difficult for folks to adhere to, and it makes it difficult, just to measure. And so we might want to rethink that and perhaps simplify and not have as many goals and realize that, incremental progress is certainly better than none, and maybe rethink that. But what I would close with, and I look forward to the discussion, there are a lot of folks here who are much more of experts in this field than I am, but I think, it's really important that with this, we have a lot of promise and we have an opportunity. And I think that Paul actually said it best in the preface to the report. What he said was, the future success of community colleges and the contributions they make to our thriving region deserves our perseverance. And I don't think that we persevered. I don't think that we gave it, a sufficient amount of time or certainly a sufficient amount of our priority. And so I'll end on kind of a bad pun, but I think we should give it the old college try, and I think we should go back at it and do it in a way informed by what we did learn. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen, for that illuminating report. We now have, okay, we'll take a couple questions now. I don't want to take a lot, but please, Beth.
First of all, thank you very much. And the second thing is I have two questions. The first is, do you know if there's any metrics that are showing if any of these community colleges are teaching in a language other than English? And the second question is, maybe a little bit harder, is there any explanation for that decline?
I am not aware of anything that measures whether or not they teach in a language other than English. I don't know, I'm going to turn to Doug, who may have better insight into that.
So there were indirectly probably, in that the formula took into account alignment with various workforce goals and gave every kind of course of teaching a score. So language courses would have been a given score, but it wasn't a specific kind of focus of it to incentivize or anything else.
And what was your second question?
Any explanation for the decline in enrollment?
I would be speculating if I said, so I don't know.
The commissioner may be able to enlighten us on this in a minute. Okay, a couple more questions. Yes and yes.
Quick one. There was a really interesting slide that you skipped by at the end, which was the dollar per student, which for many of us is easier to kind of see the impact of that versus the percentage allocations. And it looked like that range got even further. Berkshire was getting 4,000 per student and Bunker Hill still at 1,000. Is it worth just getting that slide back up there? Because those numbers were pretty interesting.
And I think that part of that is that the phenomenon where student enrollment was declining, right? And then if you have fixed cost, it's a factor of, when you do the math, that some of those community colleges were getting significantly more per student than others.
So
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly.
that kind of allocation.
That's also part of the whole time, right? So no one got less over the course of the formula, and enrollment declined significantly at some campuses. So their per pupil spending is going to go up, whereas some enrollment didn't decline as much, and they got more as well. But it was kind of the compounding factor of that big whole harmless.
Okay, I want to
I
get.
can't go back to the slide, but I certainly will. We can share the report with everyone, and the slide is in there, so that may be of use. So sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah, I want to go back to the program because we are live streaming this, and we're very fortunate to have with us this morning the Chief Higher Education Officer of the Commonwealth, Carlos Santiago, a good friend of ours, someone who we have worked with for many years. And Commissioner, I'd like to offer you an opportunity to make a few remarks this morning. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the Boston Foundation for hosting this event. Once again, they've been wonderful hosts on a number of projects of ours. And thank you to the Massachusetts Taxpayers Association for this report. I'm going to give you a bit of history and a sense of where we go from here. I reviewed the report. It's quite accurate in its portrayal of the status of the performance-based funding formula. Its development and its sporadic nature of the amount of resources that were invested in it are all true. Recommendations for future action certainly merit study and consideration, so I want to focus on where this particular formula stands today and whether it has a significant role to play in improving public higher education outcomes. So I want to look a little bit at the past, and I did arrive in Massachusetts in 2013, and one of my jobs as overseeing our institutional research was to work on the development of this formula. And it was in part a negotiation with the community colleges over the metrics, over how the formula would work. And at the time, the Vision Project was more than emerging, but the Vision Project was tied to the formula. But there were certain constraints in terms of the data, for example. The issue of the lack of transparency was quite true, and it was part of the discussions that we had. It's also true that when I became commissioner in 2015, the amount of funding that went into the performance-based funding formula declined significantly. So where are we today? Today, I think we're actually in a good place for the funding formula if we were to use it. And let me explain what I mean by that. We have spent the last year talking with the community colleges, state universities, and UMass campuses about metrics. How we define our goals is crucially important. And coming to agreement on the definition of the goals is crucially important. And Jonathan, who's in the back, our institutional research director, how many metrics are we bringing to the board next week for approval?
I think it's 40 with all the...
About 40 different measures. We are, by statute, required to provide a performance measurement report, which is based on this information. When we did the Vision Project, we did away with that report, and we are coming back to it as well. So there were a lot of reasons why it was not moved forward. I think we're actually in a good place, but the real question I have is the performance-based funding formula the game changer that many people thought, including myself when we started, moving towards the future? And I wanted to read a quote, because there's many states have embarked on this. I wanted to read a quote from a well-known book out of Johns Hopkins Press called The Attainment Agenda, State Policy, Leadership, and Higher Education by Laura Perney and Joni Finney. And I think the quote sums up the sort of the national experience with performance-based funding. Performance funding systems have been implemented in the past with limited, meaningful impact on higher education performance. Past systems have historically involved relatively small amounts of funding, likely creating insufficient incentives for colleges and universities to respond to statewide goals and priorities, and have had uneven political support, particularly from higher education. Other forces that may have contributed to the limited effectiveness of past performance funding efforts pertain to the challenges of identifying performance measures that apply across higher education sectors, instability in funding and funding formula, inadequate attention to differences in institutional capacity and resources, and insufficient attention to unintended consequences for enrollment, academic selectivity of admissions, mission, and compliance costs. And I think that does, the report does substantiate that particular perspective. So, is it the game changer? I would argue historically, if you look at public higher education, the golden years of public higher education, I know there was a question about enrollment decline, the golden years were 1943 to 1979. That's when our great systems of public higher education were created. That's when states invested huge amounts of resources, particularly in buildings and in people in these systems. That was when the baby boomers took advantage of higher education and got their credentials. There was a decline that started in 1980, and I do say this for full disclosure. I entered the academy in 1980 when the golden years were on the decline. No causality, but that's what happened. And I became commissioner in 2015 when the funding for the funding formula dried up. There, again, hopefully no causality, but nonetheless. what we saw between 1980 and 1990 was a decline in enrollment, pretty much across all the segments, as the baby boomers were graduating and finishing their college experience. But we saw a boom between 1990 and 2010, which if you ever would use a performance-based funding formula, that was the time to use it. Because while per student funding, state funding went down, the numbers of students were coming to our institutions. That's what I call the competitive period of public higher education, and Massachusetts was very much involved, and our community colleges were growing and thriving and expanding, even though the funding per student on the state level was going down. That was competition. The funding formula, had we been able to structure it in such a way over that period of time, I think could have been much more beneficial than it was afterwards. So where are we now? We're in a difficult period for higher education in general, not only public, but private higher education. Yes, enrollments are down. Enrollments are down in the community college segment more than any other place. Why? Demography is part of it, but it's also the economy. And I think our community colleges, because of the robust economy in Massachusetts, students have been leaving the community colleges in large numbers, just as they went into the community colleges in large numbers during the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. So, is it the game changer? Is this what we need to change the outcomes? One might argue that it could be, if it's structured appropriately, if we now have metrics. We are, the Board of Higher Education is moved from the Vision Project to what we call the Big Three, which is a subset of the Vision Project. It focuses on access, it's affordability, closing gaps, and student success. We're highlighting those particular areas. So in some respects, the funding formula would have to adapt to that. But we're also looking at a strategic planning process that it launches next week. It's a year-long process to really focus on equity. Massachusetts is the most educated state in the nation. 56% of our population hold a higher education degree or credential. We are number one, but we are at the bottom of the pack when it comes to closing equity gaps. The inequality is dramatic. And during that period of 1943 to 1979, it's worth mentioning, that was the period where this country reduced its inequality more than any other period of time. It's when social mobility expanded, and it's when our public systems were growing and expanding as well. When I look at a game changer, and something we've been focusing on the years that I've been commissioner, when I look at a game changer, I look at something that is about blocking and tackling. Today, and I will be running off to our Academic Affairs Committee, we will be recommending to the board the most sweeping revisions to remedial education in the Commonwealth since the 1998 placement policies. That's a game changer, because the success rate among students in remedial education has been around 20%. And the campuses have been making major changes, community colleges in particular, to reduce that amount. And they're moving, we are now allowing the campuses, assuming the board approves this, which I hope they will, to use alternative placement standards, to move away from AccuPlacer as a gatekeeper, and move towards a GPA standard that the national data suggests is the way to go. And our own data suggests students that are taken, that are pushed into remediation either by AccuPlacer or GPA, that their performance is equal if they're put into a credit-bearing course. There's no difference in outcomes. That's a game changer. The transfer work, creating a seamless system of transfer, is hugely important as well, and we have managed to do that. We're focusing on things that sometimes you wouldn't think about for public higher education. We're focusing on student hunger. We're focusing on student homelessness. Massachusetts students in our community college segment in particular go hungry, and they go homeless. Some of them are temporarily homeless. The reality is that if we don't deal with these basic issues, no matter how good a funding formula we come up with, we're not going to get the outcomes that we need. We need to look at student success. We need to look at the support structures that need to ensure student success. We need to look at affordability. Students are left with huge amounts of debt, even in our public system as well as our private system. We need to focus on that. We need to make it more affordable. We're looking at things like open educational resources. Students drop out because they can't pay for the textbooks. Students drop out because they can't get transportation. Students drop out because they can't get access to affordable childcare. These are issues that we need to deal with as well. And I think that as we focus on those things, there will be a place for a performance-based funding formula. There will be a role for it to play as well. Our strategy has been to put money into financial aid, to give the money to the students. The governor's budget last year, in FY18, put in $7 million for community college students only, and it covers all of the unmet family need. So students Pell eligible and above, slightly above, students have an opportunity to go to the community college and have their basic expenditures, tuition and fees covered. We've, in this budget for FY19, we have asked that monies be put in for the state universities to do the exact same thing. Our financial aid bucket, and that $7 million that came in last year was the first time anyone can ever remember in over 25 years that financial aid in Massachusetts increased. Massachusetts does not have a good record in terms of providing financial aid per student. We're among the bottom states in that particular area. So the bottom line, I think there's a lot to do. I'm appreciative of the report. I think it's important that various perspectives on how we can succeed and how the community college segment in particular can succeed be put at the forefront. But I'm proud of the work of the community colleges. I've always said, I know there may be some state university representatives here, I've always said that that's where the heavy lifting occurs. They are taking students that walk in the door that may not have thought fully about what college entails. Early college, we've launched early college high schools. We have 9 designations among our community colleges. That's a game changer. If students with limited access to higher education, students that have been underserved historically in the cities and towns in which they live in and have been left behind, if they can benefit from an experience of college before they get to college, from taking a college course, we know the data suggests that those students will go on to college, will graduate from high school, and will succeed in college as well. Those are the things that I call game changers. I'm more than happy to have the conversation with our community college colleagues on where we go from here, how they view this perspective. Massachusetts, as you know, is a very decentralized public higher education system, extremely decentralized. I've worked in Wisconsin and the State University of New York. They're very centralized. I've come to appreciate the decentralized nature of this system. It is collaborative. And as we look at the enrollment decline, and I can tell you by 2025, that enrollment decline is going to fall even more. It's a cliff. We've seen it. We've seen the data. We've seen the results. The numbers of students going from high school to college is going down dramatically. Our traditional age students are going down in significant numbers. There is growth. There is growth among populations that have historically not been well served, particularly brown and black children in our society. We need to address that. We need to address it directly. But I think the model, and my campus presidents know this because I've told them and discussed with them many times, our model needs to be collaborative. Collaboration, I think, will be the key that will help public higher education in the Commonwealth not only survive, but thrive. And we've seen it. When Framingham State University, that has excess beds, opens its doors so that Mass-based students that are homeless can go and spend temporarily time using the facilities at Framingham, that's collaboration. And I think that's where we get to the next step. And last Friday, I know the president of North Shore was here. Wonderful MOU signing between North Shore Community College and Salem State. They've been working together for years. I think now we realize that the system, the success of the system will depend on that collaboration. So thank you, Eileen, for the report. I think it's been very, very important. And we would love to engage you as we move forward. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I know you have another engagement, but we so appreciate you being with us this morning. Now to get further into these issues, we are going to have our panel, and it's really a terrific group, which will be moderated by Marybeth Campbell of the Boston Foundation, who is the Executive Director of Skillworks and in charge of the growing body of workforce programs the Foundation is supporting. And she will introduce the panel. Marybeth.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. This is an exciting topic, exciting morning. Thank you all for being here. See a lot of familiar faces and expect a good conversation in the panel. So I'm going to take a quick minute just to introduce everyone, our esteemed panelists that have joined me up here on stage. And then we're going to get right into some questions. We're going to play a little catch-up. We're a little bit behind, but we'll play some catch-up and make sure that we conclude today at 10:30 and make sure that we get to your questions and dialogue too. So to my immediate right is one of my newest neighbors from the great heart of the Commonwealth, Worcester, Massachusetts, President Luis Pedraja from Quinsigamond Community College. To his right is Dr. Kimberly James from Tunxis Community College, Director of Student Learning and Access. To her immediate right is Dan O'Connell, President of Massachusetts Competitive Partnership, a partner in a lot of the work that TBF does around our community college efforts. And to his immediate right, President Glenn from Northern Essex Community College. So thank you all for being here this morning. I just want to take a quick minute to give everyone a chance to react and reflect both to Eileen's remarks in the Mass Taxpayer Foundation report and some of the remarks that Commissioner Santiago also offered. So we can go in order, or anyone who has a burning desire to start first.
I'd be happy to go in order. I appreciated the report and the work of the Boston Foundation in bringing to light some of the issues with the funding that had been received. Being new to the Commonwealth, I did not experience the swing in the formula coming up and then not being applied. But I do see the end results. We serve 50% of the undergraduates in the Commonwealth and train the bulk of the Commonwealth residents in the workforce. However, we only get about 25% of state funding. And I think that is limiting. I do agree that sometimes performance-based formulas are useful in incentivizing some of the programs that help improve things like retention and equity, but the reality is that they might incentivize the work that we are already doing, but often it does not provide any metrics that show that it makes a difference in the students. The students do not necessarily improve based on just a performance-based formula. What does work is incentivizing a amount of money that is received per student. In other words, in many places, what we do is we take the pot of money that we want to allocate to higher education and then divide it along some formulas that are created, often using metrics that are not reflective of what happens in the community colleges, the type of students that we serve. Many of them go in part-time, who take longer to get through their education, as the commissioner already said, who face significant issues like hunger and homelessness, where they're supporting families, which gives them less resources to devote to their education, less time. And the formulas that are used are more based on situations that are more applicable to four-year traditional colleges and metrics that sometimes are unrealistic. So instead of saying, let's take this formula and see the amount of money that we're going to use for higher education and then divide it along the formula, we need to think, what is the outcome that we want to achieve? What is it that we want community colleges to do for our students? And what would it take to do that? How much money should we devote to get what we want and performance of the community college? And then put that money towards it, a per student basis. Maybe incentivize things like innovation, things that we're often asked to do but don't have any resources to do. And to incentivize some of the other programs. But take the minimum amount, or hopefully the maximum, that should be applied to get the results that we want, rather than set up some results and say, here's the amount of money, now get the results based on that.
We're going to come back to the innovation question as well towards the end of the conversation, so get those ideas flowing too. Dr. James?
Yes, I definitely agree with what you were saying. I also want to commend the commissioner for really bringing to light the homelessness and the things that are going on our campuses that we don't tend to pay enough attention to. If students come onto our campuses hungry and homeless, it doesn't matter what kind of metric we have because we're not going to meet them. And so I think that that is a real important issue. I know that in Connecticut we've been spending a lot more time focusing on the direct needs of the immediate needs of the students, and the homelessness and hunger has definitely grown, definitely.
The business community is metrics driven and appropriate metrics that give us some valuable information. For instance, there are part-time students, there are non-traditional students. It takes a long time to complete the program, but when you complete the program, did you get a job in your field of study? And was that a job that allowed you to receive a higher income than you had before you went through the program? I think these issues, Kimberly, that you just mentioned, homelessness, transportation issues, we've run a very successful internship program with Bunker Hill, over 525 students through it so far. But we had attendance issues at the very beginning of it. It's because the students couldn't afford to get to the jobs. They couldn't afford it. So we brought T-passes for everyone in the program, from $180 to $500 a month, plus the hourly paid internship amount. Now we have no attendance problems whatsoever. I have a concern for what the commissioner mentioned about increasing financial aid. I think that's a good thing. And our goal at MACP is to get the business community behind more funding for public higher education. It is very valuable, and we want the biggest coalition arguing that as possible. But financial aid to complete a curriculum which is not aligned with where the jobs are is not a good investment. So let's look at the curricula. Let's look at the connection between the academicians and the business community and make sure those curricula are preparing students for the jobs that will be there upon their completion of the program.
Dan, I'm going to come back to that point in just a minute, but let President Glenn and put a little twist on your reflection, because you were a relatively new president to Northern Essex when community college reform was being implemented, one of our first meetings. I was new to the job at that point. Yes, at Quinsigamond, actually. Can you reflect in the sense of what you, as a new president coming in over the last 4 years, what you've seen and how, particularly how it's impacted Northern Essex?
Yeah, so going back 7 or 8 years, really. So we've come a long way. I also want to echo my colleague President Pedraja's comments and thank the Boston Foundation, Eileen and the Mass Taxpayers Association, Dan and the Mass Competitive Partnership. This whole dialogue has come a long way. This is an outstanding report. It shows a lot of insight into who we are and how we operate and how the state funds and doesn't fund us. And the surge of support for this mission has just advanced so much over the last 7 or 8 years. From that meeting at Quinsig a while back when we were all sort of fresh to this and sort of figuring out how to make things better. So we share that common cause, and I'm grateful for that. I think one of the things that is a little bit missed in this, and Commissioner Santiago started to pick up on it, was that maybe the halcyon days for something like a performance-based funding formula were quite some time ago. In my career in higher education, so back 25, 30 years, ago, my institution was 80% state funded, and things like Pell Grants would take care of a student's entire experience at my institution. There's not, I think this is accurate, somebody in the room correct me if it's not, there is not a single college or university in the state of Massachusetts that is more than 50% publicly funded. We are all predominantly private, and we all increasingly function that way. A lot of my job now is about fundraising. We're always looking for ROI, to Dan's point about the business perspective. We now fund institutional aid at a level that most of our public colleges, especially community colleges, never did before, which means basically we'll subsidize the cost of students who can't afford us, just like the privates do. We increasingly function like private colleges and universities, and so some of the models that maybe used to work and used to incentivize, as the amount of funding to us decreases, it's not irrelevant, but it's headed in that direction. I mean, the time for this dialogue has shifted, and the focus on it has shifted. And I'm sure we'll get into some of this as we talk on the panel here, but a few of the challenges that we've discovered even since 2011 when this began around performance-based funding have to do with geography and its effect on students, and how these formulas often disproportionately harm low-income minority students, especially in gateway cities, not just in Massachusetts, but around the country, and how they incentivize or don't incentivize, as the commissioner was saying, collaboration at a time when we need it versus competition. So those are some themes that I think as we talk here, I'd certainly like to come back to, because there are some important elements of those as we look ahead to what we can do productively that I think we need to keep in mind.
Dan, I want to come back to something that you mentioned regarding the business influence and input in this, both in resources and time and engagement. What part of the narrative in the FY13 reform was to build business input and business engagement across the community colleges? And at the time, there's also discussion of creating sort of a match funding strategy to the incentivized dollars that came through the state funds, that first $20 million at least. But that didn't necessarily come to fruition directly into a matched fund, but there's certainly been engagement, the competitive partnership being the primary example of initiating Learn to Earn and other business engagement at the campus level. What would it take to create that kind of, as President Glenn mentions, the time that is consumed by presidents now developing private funding resources? What does it take for business to enact themselves into the campuses and invest through resources, both financially and others? What are the things that you look for across metrics, but also just generally across the campus that makes that commitment real for business?
Well, I think enlightened self-interest of the business community. The talent is what drives the Massachusetts economy. We don't have oil or gas or gold mines in our state. And that talent pool needs to be as robust as possible for our economy and our businesses to continue to expand. Community colleges are a critical part of that talent pool. So it's aligning the curricula at the colleges with the workforce, the job needs that are in that region or in other parts of the state. Learn and Earn is an example of that. 11 of our member companies participate. As I mentioned, 525 students so far, 2/3 of them representing diversity from Bunker Hill Community College, paid internships with a mentor on the workforce side and a faculty advisor at Bunker Hill, credit for the internships at the school, and a great working relationship between the mentor and the faculty advisor. It took a while. There were almost different languages spoken between a business mentor and a faculty advisor, but they came together and made the program a success. We've expanded our efforts. We've worked with Springfield Tech and Holyoke on the advanced manufacturing program, where the curriculum was developed jointly by the head of Raytheon's largest facility, their Andover facility, and the faculty at Springfield Tech, with Holyoke providing English as a second language and technical language expertise to the students. Every student that's graduated from that program has had a job on the date of their completion of the program. That shows the demand and shows what happens when you align the resources. So I think the abandonment of the metrics is a concern to the business community. We need to be convinced that the right kind of data is being gathered in a transparent way and consistent way. You can't change the rules every year. It doesn't work. You don't get anything of value out of that. But that kind of alignment and the outreach, I know Lane has done it in his putting business representatives on your board of, as has Luis as well, a board of advisors, whatever it's called. What do you call it? Trustees. So that voice is heard in the community, in the academic community. That is also helpful.
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond a little bit to that, Dan, because I think you made an important point of helping businesses also see the role that we play in developing the workforce. One of the alignment piece, I agree that we could always continue to align our curriculum to work and train students to the workforce demands of the future. One of the challenges that I face is that often when we're training students, I always tell my faculty, my staff, and even my board, where it has the business leaders in, that we need to train students for the works of tomorrow. Not necessarily the work of yesteryears, or even some of the work that needs today, because it'll take them a couple of years to get out with the skill sets. So we need to be looking ahead. And I think critical to this is that we work with the business community, and that the business community brings us to the table. So where they see the business needs developing, we can start preparing for it ahead of time rather than in response. The other thing is that a lot of times, because we're seen as public and government funded, there is this pressure from the business to say, well, you're supposed to train them, you're getting taxpayer money, but they're not always investing sufficiently in that workforce of tomorrow by putting resources to helping our students, funding initiatives, or helping us develop innovative programs through those conversations.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that one of the critical issues is that we start with clearly defining state workforce priorities. If the state clearly defines their workforce priorities, then the community colleges can then take that information and create programs in partnership with business. In Connecticut, we've done a lot of that, and we're in the process of doing a lot of that now, especially around the advanced manufacturing. We've brought a lot of our manufacturers to the table, and they are helping us create the curriculum, adjust the programs to meet their needs, because they're the ones who truly know what they're looking for. And so they need to be committed to the process just as we need to be committed to the process.
Dr. James, I'm going to stay with you for a minute because you wrote your thesis on this particular topic. My first question on our side was, what compelled you to write your thesis on this issue? It's a deep and it can go in many different directions, as you said you've experienced. Can you speak to both your experience in Connecticut, but your research in terms of, I think it would be consistent with both the report, but just speak to any nuances that you've seen across systems and states that have tried to implement this, and in your own experience in Connecticut.
Yeah, one of the things I liked about reading the report is very consistent with my research. I mean, we continue to use performance-based funding systems with lack of evidence that they actually work. And that holds true to today. There still needs to be a lot more research to produce that evidence. But again, like we've been saying, and I think the whole panel has said, we have to compare apples to apples, and we have to compare them over a period of time. We don't get anything by stepping in and out of the formula or picking and choosing what pieces of the formula that we're going to use. So we need to have, I would say, a minimum of 5 years to really track. But metrics is what everyone is using. I think that performance-based funding has a real chance. I don't think that Mass needs to go and reinvent the wheel. I think they have an excellent foundation to build on. But we have to be careful in how we choose metrics. We can't just pick and choose which ones are that we want to use, but we have to take a close look at our institutions and our state needs and design those metrics around that to make sure that they're trackable and they're measurable.
So for the next set of questions, I want to focus on 3 areas: the workforce theme that's come up, the equity theme, and then some of the innovation ideas. And so just on the workforce theme, as has been more recently touched on in this conversation, part of the conversation within the funding formula debate, if you will, or discussions was whether or not to include accountability to job placement in the formula, which ultimately didn't get included. But that was also part of the pressures of the reform in terms of pivoting the mission of the colleges more dually towards workforce development and academics. Can you speak to how, in the last couple of years, the Baker administration certainly has tried to formulate more workforce metrics more regionally through some of the regional planning done through the workforce boards that are inclusive of K through 12 and the higher ed system, including the community colleges. Do you get a sense from that those metrics, in terms of campus leaders, that those metrics are actually clear, that there's accountability there, and that the community colleges have played a role in trying to help both formulate that, but then do you feel accountability towards that too?
Yes. So well,
Easy.
there you go.
There's going to be a softball question.
The reality, of course, is that community colleges have always been in the workforce development business, and in every program, right? My liberal arts faculty, frankly, don't always like to hear me say that, but I was one of those at one time. I've got a theater background. I was still in the workforce development business, so we have been for a very long time. And yes, I do appreciate the focus and the process that the Baker administration has brought to these regional convenings that have allowed us to, along with the evolving technology, I mean, that's helped a lot in the last few years too, right? 10 years ago, it was hard for anybody to dig into hyper-local workforce data, and we can do that a lot more effectively now, just given new technological tools that we have. So these regional convenings have been helpful, the bringing together of the community college, state university, UMass partners in those regions with employers and workforce investment boards and all of that. And yes, we can identify, name, I could go through the catalog of them if you like, Louise probably could too, what our region's priorities are, and that has helped us focus on grants to write and ways to work with vocational schools, for example, which was something that certainly the Patrick administration began, the Baker administration continued, and you see a lot more of all around the state of Massachusetts. The rest of the country had been at that for a while, so it's about time we caught up. So yeah, there's some very, I think, promising practices that have been emerging as a result of all of those efforts. And by the way, they've been emerging over the last 5 years, even without application of the funding formula, because that's our mission.
Yeah, and I will agree. It's very helpful because we can align a lot of the work that we do in the training towards the needs of our community. And as Lane said, that has been our mission. We've been doing that all along. Community college has always focused on that. And we have a lot more data that's available, and it's easier to produce. At the same time, I'll go back to the same comment I made. We have to start thinking about the future, not what is the current needs. And often, some of the discussions reflect the current need instead of what we need to train for in 2 or 3 years. I do agree that we need to meet the current need, but we also need to be preparing for the future. And sometimes in those work boards, investment boards, meetings, and I go to a few, I see a lot of service provider. I don't see enough of the business community, the leaders, the industry, and the people who are doing the research and development that are saying this is where the business community is going. One of the things that I just came to Massachusetts from California, and one of the things that the governor did there, he put this program called the Strong Workforce funding, and he allocated to the different community colleges, and it was to develop innovation, to strengthen the work and the equity piece of preparing the workforce for tomorrow. And that money was helping the colleges incentivize that forward-looking, but that was additional money on top of the funding formula to then align the needs of the state with the workforce development and to be innovative and think ahead.
One thing Governor Baker's done is he's had some volunteer work done by Boston Consulting Group on where the middle skills jobs are going to be, what Luis is saying, not where they are now, but where they're going to be, where the gap's going to be in the workforce 5 years out, 3 years out. And they've focused on 2 areas, and we've begun to work with 2 community colleges on those areas. One is personal care assistance in the home, healthcare, and Partners Healthcare is a member of our group, and we are in the process of designing a program with Roxbury Community College to prepare people for these roles. The added advantage of that is it frees up the caregiver, who's most often a woman in the home who's had to leave the workforce to provide care for a child or a elderly individual. The other one where we're focusing, and this is with Bunker Hill, is on preschool educators, teachers in preschool, getting the highest quality teaching ability there. And the community colleges are very well suited to run these programs and prepare the individuals. And we're doing that with Bunker Hill right now, designing that. And again, it's a job that frees up individuals who otherwise would be providing that child care to rejoin the workforce. And the next element is working with the community colleges to train those individuals who've been freed up for the jobs that are going to be there when they complete their program.
President Glenn, you mentioned some of the issues around equity and some of how policies and practices can often do more harm than good. If you want to illuminate a little bit on that in your experience, that would be helpful, I think, for the audience, and what specifics you might be referring to, but also what ideas you have to overcome some of those and practices and policies that we might think about as we move forward in this conversation.
I think this is my greatest concern for however we move forward with this. So Northern Essex Community College was New England's first Title V institution, predominantly Hispanic-serving institution. There are several others in the state now that are emerging, but we've been at that for a long time. It means a lot to us culturally, how we work with students, and sometimes in performance. By design, a performance-based funding system is meant to create, if you will, winners and losers, to take resources from one place and shift it to another. That's what it's meant to do, based on performance. The capitalist in me says, go, right? I'm not averse to goals, objectives, accountability, I'm not. And some of the challenges associated with that, you heard the commissioner pick up on, right? We're in an era right now where we need collaboration more than ever among our higher ed institutions. Some of the things that have happened as a result of that collaboration over the last few years include the mass transfer agreement, which makes it so much easier now for students to take general education credits from any public institution in the state and move them to any other public institution in the state. The Commonwealth Commitment, which is a compact from among the community colleges, state universities, and University of Massachusetts campuses that can get a lot of students a bachelor's degree for under $30,000 based on how they transfer. Those things would not have happened if we had rigorously implemented a performance-based funding formula that really took serious resources from one campus to another. We'd be competing against one another. I'm not arguing against some kind of performance-based funding formula, but how we do it and what the stakes are matter, because geography is destiny. I was a community college student. I'm an atypical community college student because I went to a community college in Midwest City, Oklahoma, and I'm a long way from there. Most of our students, and at Northern Essex Community College, I mean just above 90% of our students live within 5 miles of either our Haverhill campus or our Lawrence campus. And that's the same for all my colleagues in their institutions. We are hyper-local. When you take resources away from any one of us, pick one, North Shore, Greenfield, and shift it somewhere else, the students don't follow. They're not going there. Our students are most often not deciding which college to attend, they're deciding whether to attend college, right? And if they can't do it locally, if the resources and supports aren't there for them, they're not going to go or they're going to fail. So what we've seen in these performance-based funding formulas, and I'd point you toward a report earlier this year from the Century Foundation that dug into 32 states where these have been implemented, is over time you see an erosion, particularly of resources for the students who need them the most. Universities become more selective, actually produce fewer degrees, and they become less diverse, and the communities that need the resources the most and the campuses that have the most disadvantaged students lose the most resources. We have to be very careful of that. Again, not arguing against something, but those are some things to be cautious of.
I definitely agree with a lot of what you were saying. There is, over time, you do see that the system has been gamed and that the students that need the most end up with the least. And so we're right back at the same drawing board that we stay at. But I don't know about Massachusetts, but Connecticut is territorial by nature. Our 12 community colleges are dispersed, but students have a choice. They're in their region, and we still see that the competitive nature, even without performance-based funding, I think we spend a lot of time duplicating efforts and using resources that we could use together. We have programs that we run, I know on our campuses, that aren't full on any campus, but it's the same program. So I think a lot of that kind of thing can be examined where we can better allocate our resources as well.
And I would add that community colleges are mission-based. We're serving a particular demographic and population. You saw it in the report, over 70% are low-income, minorities, English language learner, more so than in the other schools. And about half of our students come from different segments that typically might not go to college, is what Lane said. They're not deciding where to go to college, they're deciding whether to go to college. And college is a way to move ahead. A lot of them are going hungry, are facing, in Quinsigamond, we did a survey, up to 50% of our students that experience food insecurity at one point. About 19% of students between 15 and 19 experience homelessness. They're working adults, parents, single parents often, supporting children. They're working 2 or 3 jobs. The economy has improved, so they're working more, but often because they are underemployed because of their skill sets, they haven't gone to college yet, they're working multiple jobs. So that means they take less hours. So they're in the community college less time. And when you look at graduation rates or transfer rates are based on cohorts that come in on a traditional model that go full-time and go to 150%, although the iPads just changed their metrics a bit, it still doesn't reflect our population.
Right.
Some of our students are going to take 6 years to get a degree, but they're moving forward, they're moving ahead, and I think that's what's critical. So in terms of the equity, if we start taking a performance formula and we put it into helping the ones that are the high performers, they're the ones that might not be having those issues. They're the ones that are serving a different population. And I've seen in some cases community college that shifted their mission in order to adjust to a performance-based formula by raising standards, admitting less underprivileged students. In other words, to game the system and penalize those who are low income. The ones that still want to serve the low income, the immigrants, the language learners, then they're struggling. And if you limit the resources, instead of saying, what does it take to make them successful? If you say, be successful, and we'll penalize you if you're not, and this is the pot of money that you have to work with, then we're going to do our best, but we can only do so much, and we'll continuously be, our finances will continually erode, the services we provide will decrease, and it'll be more and more difficult to serve those populations, which are the ones who are more in need.
Dan.
Although, looking at the numbers in the taxpayers report, Bunker Hill, 71% of the student body represent diversity, and it benefited, that community college benefited by the performance-based funding formula. They didn't lower their percentage of minority students in any way. They serve a very challenged population on all the issues we've received, and yet the faculty and administrators at that community college were able to look at the performance-based criteria and adapt their programs to serve those, serving their students well in doing so, and coming up with a little better equity, although still on a per student basis. It was a minor increase there compared to some of the other programs. I just want to say quickly one word about Lane's liberal arts faculty. We value them. We value them greatly. We value them because oral and written communication skills and collegial thinking are such an important part, critical parts of being successful in the business world, and that comes from your liberal arts faculty. So we don't want to turn the community colleges into tech schools. That's not the goal. This broader education that the community colleges provide makes their students much better prepared to succeed in the workplace.
Thank you.
So I have 2 more questions, one directed at that comment, Dan, and then the others for the whole panel. So there is a bit of a sentiment, we didn't prepare for this question, but I'm certain you can answer it. There is a bit of a sentiment, and there's data to show that particularly in certain industries like tech, for example, where while what you are saying I think is true that businesses do value those skill sets, and that those skill sets are often the things that employers complain the most about of their workers not having. In Massachusetts, we do often use the bachelor's degree as a somewhat insufficient proxy for hiring. And there is a number, we have 15 community college campuses that serve 100,000+ students annually, and we have a labor market with 130,000+ jobs. How does the competitive partnership actually steward that action and that sentiment to value community college students?
So some leadership is being shown here again, by Partners Healthcare, by David Torchiana, who's the CEO, is a member of our group. They're the largest private employer in the state. They have almost 70,000 employees. And David ordered his HR department to review every single job description for every position at Partners and eliminate that bachelor's degree requirement wherever it didn't make any sense. And as you said, Mary Beth, it didn't make sense in a lot of instances. And David has made a presentation to our entire group of CEOs saying, each of you has to go through and do this. Our requirements are outmoded. The quality of the students that are being prepared with associate's degree are fully able to fill the majority of these positions, and we have to make those changes.
And I would add to that that middle school jobs often pay more than some of the ones that require the bachelor's degree that are higher skills. So our students are served more in terms of their buying power. They're moving up several percentile in the economic range. I think it makes a great contribution when we start looking not at what the degree is, but what's the skill set that is required. We often focus on a degree instead of focusing on the skills. And some of the liberal arts skills that you mentioned, collaborative work, writing, critical thinking, communication skills are going to be necessary. Most research shows that students are going, nowadays, are going to experience 5 to 6 or 7 job changes through their life. That about 30% or even more, the jobs that will be held in the future have not even been invented yet. We have to prepare students with the basic skills that will allow them to navigate from one job to another, from one industry sector to another, from the shifts in technology, and be able to succeed.
So last question for me, and then we'll get to the audience questions, the many burning questions out there, I'm sure. And this is more about innovation, but I'll start with, there have been a number of streams of different dollars coming into the campuses through Complete College America, Achieving the Dream, the TACT DOL grants. That was equated to at least $40 million coming into the campuses, plus the individual campuses that received other rounds. Those were, a lot of that is meant to innovate and show prototype piloting, activities that may not necessarily be more campus-wide supported, but more programmatic. Are there things in there that have been tested and proven that we should be taking to policymakers to invest in more wholly? And I'll attach that part of the question to, if you had all the resources in the world, what are the most the top 1 or 2 things that you wish you could do that make you wake up in the middle of the night and say, this would actually unlock a lot of the challenges that our students face that are student focused? I'm sure you do that all the time. So.
Yeah, you know, one of the, thanks for the question. Yesterday I was having this conversation. I was facilitating a workshop on my campus with some faculty and staff about a Hechinger report from a couple months back that said, look, 1 in 5 college students across America will not complete. That's everybody, right? Public, private, selective, community college. Throw them all into a hopper. 20% of them aren't going to finish college. Why is that? And we were having some dialogue around, all right, at our institution, what works? We know what works. We have a Title III grant, PACE grant we call it. It's been running for 30 years. It's for first-generation, low-income college students, so you meet those criteria, you get in. We can only take $250 a year. That's how much funding we have. So the result is a couple $1,000s more in funding per student for some very specific supports. All right, and those supports are all high-touch supports. They're all about letting that student know there's somebody there for them, being in constant contact with them because they're first generation, making sure they navigate some of the things about going to college like registration processes and financial aid paperwork, and looking ahead to the 4-year transfer institution and visiting campuses. 85% of these students across all 30 years successfully finish their degrees with us and transfer to a 4-year institution as a result of these high-touch interventions that cost a couple $1,000s more per head. And you can look around at programs across the country. The SUNY system in New York was one that came out with one a couple of years ago that was really ballyhooed. They're all pretty much the same. They've got these high-touch interventions that cost a few $1,000s extra a head. Maybe money is not always the solution, but in this case it is. Now the challenge for us is to scale that up across our 6,000 students. It cost about $9 million. And it would be, variously effective across different populations of students, but I can guarantee you that $9 million would take our retention and graduation rates and double-digit increase them. Absolutely.
What Lane said. I think he said it very well. It's the wraparound support services that are the game changer. We started a mentorship program. We're recruiting members of the community, and we've had some partnership with businesses that provided mentors. That has helped students navigate the waters of higher ed. We just had a Title III grant that we received, again, for increasing retention and to help support the students. There are innovative practices. There are things like Guided Pathways, the ASAP program in New York, that puts a student in a cohort and moves him along. But those have a lot of intrusive advising, a lot of those support services that are essential and critical to help the first generation low-income students be able to succeed and graduate. If they don't stay, we can't train them. You don't have a workforce, and they're facing multiple challenges. So it's the wraparound services that make the difference. You can talk a lot about the technologies and all those things. That helps. You have adaptive technology. You can talk about things like badges and other types of new degree programs, competency-based. But they have to stay in order for those programs to work.
Yeah, I'd certainly point to the TBF model of Success Boston, certainly in the partnership and collaboration in the City of Boston that points to some of that high-intensity interventions as well. And that's kind of the point, right, is that there are these pockets of work everywhere across all of the campuses, programmatically, institutionally, but we haven't necessarily elevated that to a policy resource conversation.
Yeah, I agree with everything that everyone has said. The resources for our students is the key thing, the wraparound resources. We have a large mental health issue on our campuses. We don't offer that, at least in Connecticut, and that's a real difficult thing. We have a couple of counselors on campuses, but they're not allowed to do personal counseling per se. So bringing in some of those additional support services that we see that our students need is going to be critical to keeping them there and shepherding them through the process.
Dan, do you have anything you want to add to close out this?
I'm
Okay,
fine.
great. So we're going to open this up to questions. My esteemed colleague Michelle Hinkle is in the back with microphones, as Kristen McSwain too. So I'll point to folks. Let's start here with President Gentili.
Hi. This is on, right? You talked a number of times about metrics, and I just wanted to highlight what the Commissioner stated, that over the past 2 years, there's been a statewide effort at all three sectors in public higher education to look at the metrics and to devise metrics that indeed measure what our students experience, and not just who they are, but what their progress is over time. So when you talk about business not are worried about abandoning metrics, I don't think there's any movement here in the Commonwealth to do that, but to devise metrics that look at, for example, a community college student. IPEDS, at least until recently, only looked at first-time, full-time degree-seeking students, which was only 13% of the students at North Shore Community College. An accountability system like the voluntary framework of accountability, which takes all part-time and full-time students, no matter how they start, and looks at them over 6 years to see how many graduated with a credential or a certificate, with how many transferred prior to the actual credential, how many are still enrolled. A significant portion of our students are still enrolled after 6 years. Those are all successes. Now, when you measure those successes and you look at that achievement, there's a far different picture about the community college student population and its outcomes than what IPEDS provides. So if we go to a performance funding change and further implementation, then the metrics need to be correct. And I do think that the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education has been working on that, and that we'll see improvement in that area.
Your question right next to you if you want to pass the mic over.
Hi. Hello. Thanks for being here. I'm Tuan. I'm CEO and co-founder of ScholarJet. I started a small ed tech company, very early stage, but what we do is we create skill-based competitions by partnering with employers and attach a scholarship on top of that to showcase different skill set, and then allowing students to earn scholarship without having to write essays and getting a job without submitting a resume. It's pretty cool. Anyways, I have this particular instances when we primarily are trying to work with state school and community colleges, but when it comes to giving the opportunities, as in the fall we were trying to give $10,000 away for students to participate in these competitions, and I just sat, I'm not gonna name the school, but I just spent 3 days calling one singular school, no one picks up. And then I sent emails to basically deans, professors, and multiple different resources across multiple different community colleges, and I got nothing. And then I decided to reach out to the private school and the state school, and then all of a sudden I started getting results. And so I'm like thinking, like, is there a good resource management here? I mean, we're talking about that we need resources, and here I am, created a company particularly just to try and help students who have needs, and no one is helping me to spread the words, essentially. And so I wanted to give the questions to you in terms of how do you recommend me to get around that? Because I grew up from an underserved community, so I understand that there's a lot of trust involved. And so how do we sort of like improve upon that per se? Because I assume I'm not the only one who's trying to reach community colleges to get these opportunities.
Well, a lot of it depends on, you said trust, that's a part of it. A lot of people, if they don't know who's trying to reach out to students, we get about 20,000 emails and phone calls with different marketing ideas. So let's try to figure that out. But the other piece of it is we are under-resourced. So we might not have an operator to answer the phone like a private might. Our deans and our administrators are working large number of hours. Our faculty are overtaxed. So it's very difficult for them to always respond to everything. If you want to reach one of us, you know, it's, the president's office, we usually do the work. And I'll give you one of my cars afterwards as well.
I just wanted to say, I know I'm not from the Mass area, but this happens in Connecticut as well. I think that a lot of it has to do with, we are very protective of our students, for one. I was the Director of Career Services for about 15, 16 years and did a lot of vetting. That's what I spent a lot of my time doing. So I think that's what one of the people that you might want to reach out to is the career person on the campuses, because they're more attuned to the connections that you need to make and the folks that they can connect you with to make things happen for you.
So I'm just wondering, because when I reached to the private school, it was so much easier. And
they're structured a lot different and they have a lot more staff. They have people that are devoted to specific areas.
So don't forget.
There you go. There you go. This is a start. Elizabeth, did you have a question? Okay.
I know it's probably unfair of me to ask a question, but I was listening to the commissioner talk about collaboration as the future, and I hear a lot of conversation about metrics and being innovative, and I'm 100% for that. But in the bad old days, each community college used to advocate to the legislature separately for its own funding. And I think we don't want to go back to that in the spirit of collaboration. So how do we look ahead to increasing funding in an equitable way, really meeting the needs of students? And President Pedraja and President Glenn, I'm looking at you, but it's really a question for anyone. How do we replace the old system in the future?
Good question. I was having a conversation with a bank president a couple of weeks ago in my role as chief fundraiser. And this particular president happened to have left a job. He was in higher education for like a year. He was a COO at a well-known university here in Massachusetts. And he said he left to go back into banking so he could have an easier life. It was too complicated and he couldn't figure it out. And he's a smart guy. And by that I mean, we haven't left what you're referring to as the bad old days, in the sense that there's still a place for us individually to advocate for our own resources. There has to be. So that's not completely gone, although we are far better at jointly advocating for ourselves. And just in the time that I've been president, which is 8 years now, and certainly in my career in higher ed, I've had to shift my way of thinking and not come to expect that the public, in the sense of the state, or where I used to be in the sense of municipalities, was going to be my primary funder any longer. I can't function that way. It wouldn't be right for my college. I have to think of myself as a predominantly private college president. So if you look at one of the things about the report, Eileen, that you highlighted and that concerns me too is, all right, so we codify this in legislation, which means, there it is well, we've got lots of that, right? We've got K-12 codification, we've got cities and towns aid, we've got things like the Quinn bill that doesn't exist any longer. Lots of examples of things that have been codified and not funded. We don't want to become California, where you've got codification, low tuition and fees, and you start turning students away at the door because you don't have the resources. So I think there's a dual role for us as presidents, and I don't know if this is where you wanted us to go with this, but we have to continue to advocate for that larger share of support. To Luis's point, we educate 50% of the students for 25% of the funding. But at the same time, we have to function entrepreneurially and individually for the welfare of our institutions.
I know we had a question in the back and then in the front. Michelle, right there. You guys can, yeah, there you go.
Thanks. So we've talked a lot about community colleges being under-resourced. There's been some references to particularly President Glenn being the chief fundraiser for his college, and being at a place like the Boston Foundation that manages, I think, $1 billion in philanthropic assets. I'm wondering particularly about individual philanthropy to community colleges versus corporate business philanthropy. We see huge gifts being made to places like Harvard and Johns Hopkins that arguably are probably having less of an impact than they could have at a community college. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how individual philanthropists who didn't necessarily graduate from your community college could be attracted to community colleges as an option for their philanthropy.
Well, one of the things that I just saw the statistics at a conference I was at this past weekend, there's about $260 billion are given in philanthropy a year. About half of those goes to higher education. Half of the amounts that goes to higher education, or close to that, goes to about 60 institutions. Community colleges get 1.3% of the shares, or some ridiculous amount. But we are changing lives at a more rapid pace, and we're making more of a difference. And I think once that we are better able at communicating to the donors what we're doing, the fact that our students are going hungry. I mentioned that to my foundation board. Within less than 6 months, we have raised thousands of dollars to start a food pantry. People get behind those things, but we have to get the message out. We only get about 1/3 of our funding from the state. Everybody says we're public. We're publicly assisted. We're not public institutions. And I think we need to start realizing that and be better advocates, but we also got to get the message to the public, because when I talk about those statistics or the homelessness issue, as some others have shared, people are surprised. They have not heard that, and they assume that all of our funding comes from the state. Public education is in a crisis. We don't have public education to the same level that we used to. We don't want to get to a point that we're battling each other either for resources. So we got to find that middle ground. We don't have the staff in our development offices to also go out and reach out to these big donors. And we're not producing billionaires all the time either. So it's a higher lift.
I write a blog, and a few weeks ago I wrote an open letter to the winner of the Mega Millions lottery in my blog. I wrote this, I published it on the blog at 10:30, half an hour before the drawing. I didn't know if there'd actually be a winner, but if you go back and look at the blog, that's what happened. It was an open letter to whoever the winner was going to be, saying, look, if you're going to donate $1 million to higher ed, don't give it to Harvard, give it to Northern Essex Community College or any other community college in the country, and here's why. So I refer you to the blog because I quantified every reason that someone who's going to donate something like that should not give it to Harvard. I mean this, the $38 billion endowment, but should instead, because you're going to serve maybe 4 students over here, you're going to serve hundreds of students over here, and here's how you're going to serve them, put them in the middle class. It's going to be a generational benefit, right, to students who, all kinds of reasons, but I'll point you to the blogs there.
One way to deal with this issue on individual philanthropy is, I was thinking about it when I read about Jeff Bezos from Amazon and his focus on preschool education. We need to educate Jeff that community colleges are going to be the entities that prepare the teachers for those classrooms. And I think that's a logical next step for him. So it's taking that next step with the individual philanthropists who've already focused on an area where we serve in the community college world.
Better job telling our story. For
That
sure.
Mega Millions winner was a college student, so I'm sure the money will be spent wisely.
Thank you. I am Jim Mabry, president of Middlesex Community College, and I chair the Council of Presidents Legislative Affairs Committee. So what you talked about is, we do go in jointly. We have a list of our top priorities, and we do go down to the legislature and ask for things for all 15 community colleges all the time. But the problem is, as Lane pointed out, when our base funding goes up 1% in a year of 2% inflation, we're all scrambling for every penny we can find. When our healthcare costs go up that year 5%, when our contracts, which are not supported after the first year, go up 2.5%, we're losing out every year. So we've lost 30% of our per pupil funding in the last 15 years, right? The presidents can't sit on their campus saying, oh, we've got to work together, right? Now, we do collaborate on a lot of different projects. We're all in the same business. As Lynn pointed out, our students don't travel, so we don't compete really for students. There's no public transportation that helps us in that, so we are collaborators all the time. So, but we're forced to go out on our own, especially for capital funding. The capital funding, they financed 6 of 30 projects last year. Where are we going to get that money for our buildings? That's the struggle we have. And they pit us against each other in those bidding processes. So asking us all to work together is nice, but not reality. We do it partly, but we can't do it totally.
So we have 2 questions in the back, and I think we have time for about 1 or 2 more questions, and then our panelists will be here for a little bit after the panel too.
Good morning. My name is Jeremy Thompson. I'm with the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. So it's funny to hear you writing a blog, kind of begging a millionaire to donate money. But as we know, last year there was kind of almost a $2 billion tax initiative that the voters didn't get a chance to vote on because the Supreme Judicial Court said that the language of the Fair Share Amendment was illegal. I mean, you talk about collaborating, you talk about organizing, you talk about being pitted against each other. What I haven't heard, somewhat bizarrely, I guess, is kind of organizing across campuses in segments to go to the State House to fight for progressive revenue. Is that on the agenda for the next couple of years? So some of this, frankly, nasty language about being pitted against each other and competing doesn't have to dominate the discussion anymore?
We do organize as the president there has shared. He shares our legislative affairs. We're not allowed to lobby, but we are allowed to advocate for our campuses, and we do that jointly. One of the big pieces was funding the labor agreements, those contracts. We got the funding this year when we haven't had it, and then the report indicates that that was part of the formula, that should be something that's added separately. It makes a big difference in our campuses. But if not, all that is on the back of the students. I don't know if Lane wants to add.
Well, yes, we knew, certainly we're conscious of the millionaire's tax and had strategies prepared in the event that became reality, and behind the scenes, certainly we're having conversations in our own way, urging some form of, as you said, progressive revenue enhancement. And, back to reality, simultaneously, we have to be doing all these other things for the world that we live in.
So we have a question from Paul up front, and then we'll end with Terry in the back.
This is for Dan. Dan, how anxious is the business community about the workforce of the future? And can that anxiety translate into support for community colleges in 2 ways? One is direct business involvement through Learn to Earn and other efforts, but also getting the business community to lobby the legislature for more funding for these vital institutions.
so extremely anxious, Paul, about where the workforce is going to come from to fill the jobs and the alignment of the skills with those jobs, as Kimberly mentioned. And yes, we have played a lobbying role, not only in the State House, but we're starting to raise our profile in Washington. Department of Education is not the best place to do it in Washington right now. But Department of Labor, there's a lot of federal labor funds that come into workforce funds that are not effectively utilized. And certain DOL grants have been helpful to community colleges. So we've been down there lobbying. Senator Rubio, Marco Rubio from Florida, has a key committee position in the Senate and is a strong supporter of community colleges. His closest friend is the president of Miami-Dade, one of the most successful community colleges in the country. And so we're talking to him about redirecting that funding more effectively to the community colleges who have proven they can do the job. And I think there's a real shot at both the state level and the federal level for the business community to help bring some resources to bear, to push to bring some resources to bear.
So last question in the back, and then our panelists will be available for a little bit afterwards.
So I think more than a question is a comment. People are talking about, and I heard the commissioner talk about the economy being good, and that's why students are not getting involved in community colleges. I think the issue more than that is that when they graduate. Hey, okay. So the issue is bigger than that. I think it's students are refusing to go because it's not worth it to go to community colleges, because people are graduating with master's degree and still eligible for food stamp, a high percentile. So we can train and educate, and I'm pro-education 100% and a community college graduate. But I think we need to combine and align graduation with pay rate. And that's for the businesses and the taxpayer. We have to value education, and therefore we need to embrace the education, and with that, the compensation with it. And if you look at that metrics, I think we can come up with better approach. If taxpayers are involved in the education process, and they are to be reported in metrics outcome, I think it's only fair that they start looking at college graduate as a compensation for better salary or better pay.
Any response to that?
I hear and recognize your concerns. I'm always a little cautious about how I characterize the value of, well, I'm not cautious, frankly. I always characterize the value of a college degree as being more worth it than not. I really do. Because it is. Statistically speaking, you are far more likely to be employed, to have benefits, to earn hundreds of thousands of dollars or more a year in your career, in any field, by the way, whatever degree you graduate with. And even the student debt issue, which is a sensitive one, and we don't want students graduating with debt. The reality is a majority of community college students graduate with zero debt. Those who do have debt, it's under $10,000. And less than 6% of the students with debt in the country have six-figure debt. That whole business of $100,000 in debt working as a barista at Starbucks, there might be 2 of those. Let's get real, all right? The 6% is largely doctors and lawyers. It is. Dig into it. Don't get me wrong, the debt issue is a huge one. And Massachusetts, by the way, is toward the top of that pile, unfortunately. We're up around the $30,000 mark now. That's less than the average cost of a new car. So I'm cautious how I weigh those things. It's all real. We just have to measure the hyperbole around some of that stuff. The value of a college degree is as strong as it's ever been, and we have a responsibility to make sure it stays there.
And I would like to add that, like I said earlier, the middle middle skilled jobs that are the highest demands, associate degrees prepare students for that. A lot of our students are getting certificates. So to say that a master's student doesn't have a job is one thing, but most of the community college students can get better jobs than the ones that they have. What happens is that they are taking care of families. So they're adult learners. They're not necessarily people who came out of high school and went to a four-year institution. So they are taking longer, it's taking harder, and making hard choices. The choice is, do I take a class or do I feed my family? as opposed to what major I'm going to decide on. So they do get jobs. It just takes them longer. It's a longer investment of time, and sometimes they feel that they just can't make that hard choice of not finding food for the family, or hoping that maybe 2 years later, when they get a degree, they'll earn a little bit more. It's a difficult choice for them to make, and frankly, I don't think it's a choice they should have to make.
Right. And a lot of them stop in and stop out, just like you were saying. You know, with the economy being a little bit better, statistics are showing that a lot of students are leaving to take on a second job or have been offered a better job. And so they have to circle back around at a later date to complete what they've started. And so we're seeing a lot of that trend happening now, too.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to a close here. I want to thank Commissioner Santiago, who I knew had to leave for a meeting, and Eileen in the Mass Taxpayers Foundation for your report, and especially our panelists. Thank you very much for being here this morning.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.